welcome to the Theory Studio podcast. I have with me today Andrew and Ray from Dualistic Unity. And I have to say, whenever I listen to your podcast, I always have to make sure to have like notes, my notes app or like a notebook or something. Like I tried to listen to it at the gym and I kept stopping to like write down all the insights. I was like, I can't listen to it there. So I really enjoy your podcast, guys. Thanks for creating it. Can you tell me a little bit about how it got started, how you guys met each other?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because I was just clipping up our first episode to get some more clips out there, which was back in September 2021, and it was almost like going back in time for a bit because I was doing the exact same thing. I was explaining sort of how we got together, and it's just funny to see all of the shifts in the last 17 months. But yeah, so back in July 2021, I sort of had this moment where I people call it waking up or whatever. I just say that I recognize that the idea of me is not the reality of me. And so in that, I had already been posting content for a while, and for the next couple weeks, it was all I could think about. Like I was going through some stuff the week before, and then I kind of realized that everything I was suffering through was rooted in the past, and I was fearing it happening in the future. And I imagined it kind of hit me like, what if I didn't have a past? What if I was dropped into reality right now? And it was kind of like this euphoric, freeing moment of that whole story of Andrew being dropped. And I went a little further and recognized that, oh, that whole idea of Andrew is rooted in the past. And so if I'm not the past in the way that I think I am, maybe I'm not Andrew in the way that I think I am. And it was like just blew my mind. And I felt like I was high for 3 weeks straight, kind of walking 6 inches off the ground. And then, so it was all I was posting about. And then I had a friend who I know through social media send me a video of a guy who sounded like he was talking about things very similar to what I was talking about. That guy just so happened to be Ray. So I saw the video. I was like, holy shit. And it's funny because the video was a little older. It was from 2005, back when Ray was almost exactly the same age as I was when I had that moment of realization. And so I followed him, started scrolling through his page. I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly like no one else is talking about this, identity and not being what you think you are. And so started commenting on some of his stuff. He noticed, came across my stuff in some way, shape, or form, and he wanted to start having some conversations with people who were having similar types of insights. So he was like, "Hey, you want to have a conversation?" So we did, recorded it. It was kind of like a podcast episode, but without any of the podcast stuff. And we each posted it on our own YouTube video or YouTube channels. And then about a month later, reached out again. And was like, "Hey, that conversation went pretty well. What are your thoughts on starting a podcast?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, sounds good." And you know, the rest is history, as they say.
Nice. Very cool that you guys found a way to connect through your content. I find it so hard to have these kinds of conversations with people in my life. So when I found you guys, and now that I'm a part of your Patreon and your Discord, it's like going to therapy almost all the time. I'm able to have like these conversations with people, and then when I do your live discussions and I get to see, hey, maybe I'm not the only one struggling with like identity and things like that. Because I feel like a lot of people just push it down, like they're so conditioned to define themselves and to try to figure everything out. Like our brain's constantly looking for certainty. So yeah, so it's been refreshing to be part of your community for sure.
That makes me incredibly happy, I have to say, just because while it's true, everything that Andrew said up to the moment of our meeting, my life has been weird for about half of it. So I woke up, quote unquote, in my early 20s, like really early 20s. I think it was about 21, 22. And it was to this, that I wasn't what I thought I was, that none of it was reality, that none of my thoughts were truth, and that the reality was I'm just here now and I'm everything. And so I've spent 20 years just trying to figure out how do I communicate that to people in a way that's coherent and isn't just fraught with belief and the woo and all of that. And so I find it so interesting that it was at a point where I'm like, I don't need to convince anybody. I don't need to be changing the world. I'm just going to do this because I can, because I'm leaving it for my daughter and whoever can use it. And then I run into Andrew. and dualistic unity takes off. But it was only when I surrendered the need to change everything that we actually had more influence.
And what does dualistic unity mean for those individuals that aren't familiar?
That's a great question. It's interesting because Andrew and I were talking about what to call the podcast for a while. We weren't entirely sure. And then I just came up with dualistic unity, and it's because it's a paradox. See, everybody tends to lean on one side or the other. There's the non dual philosophy that all of this is just unity, but then there's the stark reality that you are experiencing division. You are experiencing the idea of you separate from everything else. That's the truth of your existence. So it doesn't seem rational or reasonable to deny that and just say, no, no, everything is one. It's like, that's true. Everything is one and everything is divided. That's the only way that we can have that experience of unity is through division. And so they're both true. You are yourself and you are everything. It's just recognizing that neither are the truth, so you can live in the gray area, which is intelligence, which is clarity and awareness and freedom.
I love that explanation. um, yeah, in terms of like what you've named your podcast, the reason why I named mine The Theory Studio is because I've been kind of on this journey like forever. I feel like I've always asked questions. You know, I was always that like pain in the ass kind of little kid that was like, but why? Why? I always wanted to know why things were the way that they were. They didn't make sense half the time. And in my mid 20s, I really just kind of dissolved my relationship with Christianity. And it was with a close friend who started asking me, you know, simple questions that were kind of, you know, they kind of led to more like insights and deeper questions like, wait a minute, if this doesn't make sense, then that knocks down my Jenga tower of all these other beliefs. So now what the hell do I do there? So, so yeah, it's definitely been a very interesting ride. And so the Theory Studio basically came out of wanting to explore the theory of myself, the theory of people. I think that the fact that we identify so strongly with who we are based on our past. I mean, everything up until this point is pretty much data. It's just things that have happened. Yet we take that and we apply it to the future and we create all this worry and anxiety, and it's tough being human sometimes.
Especially when you think all that data means so much about you, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
I resonate with that a ton. Everything you just said, from, recognizing that past is just a story. It's just a narrative, and it doesn't actually mean anything about the reality of what you
Right.
are. It's not to say, that you should discount the past by any means, but there's a there's a weight with which we give it, when we are attached to it, and when we do think that, oh no, that's me, and it's like, no, that's just a story, that's just a narrative. Like, you are here now, and in that recognition and in the dropping of how tightly we cling to that story because we're afraid of not knowing what we are, as we drop that, like, our potential becomes so much more available. Like, all of a sudden there isn't so much holding us back because it's that story. It's the idea that, oh, I'm not good at this because I've tried once sometimes in the past, and it's like it didn't go well, and so that's me now, and that's a part of my story, and that's a lot of times what certain traumatic events can do to us, is kind of solidify that story in a way. Because if I'm not that, then what am I? I need to know what I am. It's like, you don't. You actually don't. Uncertainty is where freedom lies, but we don't recognize that very often. And then regarding the uh, letting go of Christianity, I was at a very similar age, early 20s. Had one of my best friends in college, was atheist, or agnostic or whatever, not religious at all, didn't grow up religious at all. And we would talk a lot about things like this, and I started to realize that a lot of the stuff I clung to in Catholicism just weren't making sense. So I said I was like 50% Catholic for a while, and then it just all, as that started to unravel, it's like it all starts to
Yeah.
unravel. And then the last little bit was, heaven and God I was clinging to just because I was afraid. It's like, oh, well, maybe, I don't want to go to hell. And then started to realize how much of a narrative was there as well. So I definitely resonate with that. Just questioning, and things, that Jenga tower kind of all falling apart once you get to a certain point.
Likewise. I absolutely agree. But I wanted to mention something quickly. It's funny because we were talking about the past, and the problem with the past really isn't the past. It took me forever to get this. It wasn't the stuff that happened to me that was the problem. The problem was the idea of me. So it wasn't that I was hurt by people. It's that I assumed I would always be hurt by people because somehow I deserved it. Somehow it was because I was less valuable. Somehow it was because I wasn't enough. And so every time I looked towards the future, it was, oh, that's going to keep happening. So it was always based on the idea of me. It wasn't based on the past, because if it was, I could go, yeah, it might happen, but I can change. Right, it could happen again, but I can do something different. That never occurs to us, or at least it never occurs to our brain as it tries to map a trajectory into the future based on what it knows, or rather what it thinks it knows about you. That's the funniest thing. It always gets me. It's like, I'm terrified of the future. Well, why? Well, because I don't think I can deal with it.
Yeah.
That's the only reason. That's the only reason. Once you get rid of that, once you're like, I don't know, let's find out, and you realize how often you're wrong, it gets so much easier to walk forward without needing to know.
It's funny because I recently read a book called Embracing Uncertainty, because I realized that I had this like low hum of anxiety always, like in the background, always, specifically about that, about uncertainty in the future and how are things going to play out, and what am I going to do, and what if and running all the scenarios in my brain, right? Totally paralyzing, not being able to do anything in the moment other than just wait for things to unfold the way they always do. You know what I mean? I think recently, I don't remember if it was a piece of content that I saw, or maybe it was in one of the live chats, but I remember you guys speaking about the freedom and uncertainty. And then and that, I think, Andrew, you said that the problem with situations is that we think we know what's best. So I want things to go a certain way because I think that's the best way for things to kind of pan out for me, only to then find out later that maybe, maybe an alternative would have been better.
That's funny how much we fear uncertainty when that's the basis of reality. Everything is always uncertain. And not only, as you mentioned, like it goes even beyond that, yeah, everything's uncertain, but your idea of what the best case scenario is also uncertain. That thing that you think is the worst case scenario could lead to something that's the best case scenario. So it's like layer upon layer of uncertainty. And the more comfortable you get with seeing all of those layers and being like, okay, yeah, I don't know, but I've never actually known. I've just created this sort of false certainty to make myself temporarily feel better. And because we have the illusion that we could ever have certainty, then when we feel like we're losing it, we like shell up and we get panic attacks and we freak out, and it's extremely uncomfortable. And it's only because we thought at one point we could have that certainty. So when you recognize that you never can, and you're like, okay, I never can. So when things start to feel uncertain, that's par for the course. That's how it's always been. So it really isn't about trying to find more and more certainties or clinging to certain beliefs. It's just about becoming more and more and more comfortable with the reality of that uncertainty.
I think that a lot of the fear around uncertainty, kind of, at least mine personally, comes a lot from the way that I was raised in terms of religion and church. You're taught not to question much, right? You shouldn't be asking questions. And I see Ray shaking his head. Don't ask questions. That's like the number one thing you're not supposed to do. And everything's kind of laid out. God has this sort of plan for your life. And I know I mentioned it in a call, but it would drive me crazy. I feel like I've been part of like the quarter life crisis club since my mid-20s or something, because of this idea of purpose. And I've always been told, that God has placed this purpose for you, created this purpose for you, and you better find out what it is. Now, the catch is he's not going to tell you what it is. It's that important. You're going to save the fucking world, but he's not going to tell you what it is. You have to find these signs and people and text, and you have to fucking become a magician to figure out what it is and where it is. And if you don't figure it out, you're cosmically screwed. You disappointed him somehow. So having to unpack all that in my 20s was really hard. And even now in my 30s, I'm still finding remnants of that belief system somehow. I thought I washed it all away, but apparently I'm still working on it. I see you laughing over there, Ray.
I was steeped in Roman Catholicism. I went through it the hard way. And because I had such a traumatic past, I really clung to God. Like, right up until, I don't know, 5, 10 years ago, in moments of deep stress, I'd find myself like talking to the universe and then stopping, going, what am I doing? Who am I talking to? And it was always just that stress response. It's a coping mechanism. It really is. And we learn to use it that way. But it's so interesting because everything you were saying is so close to being what it actually is, and yet not at all, because there is that perceived division. So we were talking about purpose in the group chat that you were in last time. And it's so very interesting because we have to find our purpose. That's almost the case, except that you are your purpose. So the real answer is you have to find yourself. So every moment, moment to moment to moment, the real question is, do you feel like yourself? And my daughter, who is 15, was having this conversation with me yesterday. She's like, how do I know when I'm being myself? And it really comes down to whether or not you think you should be something other than what you're doing right now. Right? Whether you feel like you're not enough or that you should be doing something that somebody else is doing. As soon as you're thinking about yourself, you are now no longer being yourself, which is a real kick in the teeth again, because that means that all you have to do is stop thinking about it and poof, you've been being yourself the whole damn time. It's just that you weren't able to appreciate it. So that's our purpose. If there's a purpose in our life, it's deeply personal in that you should feel free enough to be who you are. That's it. Doesn't mean anything else. It's not about a purpose in the world. It's about a purpose in this moment for you. And so it really is the purpose of God, because you're God. You are actually the universe in action. You are not divided from everything. So the more yourself you are, the more godly you are. The more you are an actual extension of the universe without interfering because you're afraid, without interfering because you perceive division, without interfering because you need more for yourself. And so you become altruistic simply by virtue of that state of mind. It's not that you're giving to people, you're giving to yourself. It becomes an entirely different experience. And religion, Catholicism, all monotheistic religions miss this because they're so busy looking up at some fictional God rather than recognizing they're God. We are God. You and your neighbor are one. Jesus was saying the same thing. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And he even said, and like the first, love your neighbor as yourself. They're the same thing. And yet everybody misses it. John 10:34, is it not written that you are God's?
And a lot of times when people first hear that, when they're so caught up in the conceptual narratives and whatnot, they're like, oh, so my purpose is to find myself. Okay, well, let's think about that. Well, I like this. I have this opinion. You know, I'm a fan of this. I'm this. Okay, there's a start. It's like, no, because it's almost so counterintuitive, because you can never know that self that you are. It's what you are. Like the knower can't know itself. Like the tip of my finger can't point to itself. My teeth can't bite itself. Alan Watts, has plenty of speeches about that. Fire can't burn itself. A tongue can't taste itself. Like you can't know yourself because you are yourself. Anything that you know is going to be an idea. Anything that you point to isn't it, because you're the one pointing. And so because we're so caught up in the conceptual, like we think a tree is the word tree. It's like, no, that's just reality over there. Like this desk is a desk, and that comes with all of these conceptual ideas. Like, no, it's reality, and it's just like you. But we have the same sort of idea. Like, what is Andrew, and what does that mean? What is Brandy? What is Ray? And so we come up with these things because our brain so badly wants certainty. And so it tries to settle upon things, but your brain can't know yourself. Any idea it settles upon is not you. And so the process of knowing yourself, the reality of knowing yourself, is just finding out in each and every moment and understanding that you're never what you think you are. So when we say things like, you got to stay on the ball with it, it's not like this active process as much as it's a letting go of everything you try to settle upon, because as much as it's so important to continue questioning always, it's a big part because our brain is trying to do the opposite at all times. Like it's trying to settle upon certainties. It's trying to make life easier for us, but it doesn't really know how to. It's trying to settle upon certainties. And then once you do, it does everything it can to try and confirm that, because that's what it does. And it's such a powerful tool that if you're not constantly questioning anything that it settles upon, you risk going down a whole nother path. It's like, okay, I'm this. Okay. And then it's going to see everything in reality, going to try and confirm it, going to create more thoughts about you. And it's like that idea begins to form more and more and more. And so it's, tending, we were talking about it last week, tending to your garden, always tending to that idea of yourself, recognizing that you're never it. Because as soon as you settle upon something, it all starts to, pile up on top of that. And that pile is a resistance to the flow of reality. In order to stay in that flow, you have to remain uncertain. In order to stay free, you have to remain uncertain. And so questioning is one of the most important things you can ever possibly do. Questioning reality, yes, but especially questioning yourself, because your brain's going to pretty much always try and do the opposite of that.
Now, I just want to add very quickly that it's really funny that when we circle around this way and we start talking about embracing uncertainty, not settling on an answer, never settling on an idea of yourself, we're talking about the reality of faith. The reality of faith that religion never touches, because it's always clinging to a fiction. It's always clinging to some narratives, to some structure that tells you what to do. There's no faith in religion because it's based on belief. True faith is just walking forward without belief. This is why Andrew and I have often joked that the only true unifying religion is none, because we're all in that together.
Yeah, I love that. I think that for a lot of people, like the need to define yourself is huge, especially at a young age, and even more now. Now there's even more labels and more ways to kind of like separate us, I remember being a kid and like going to parties with my parents and everyone asking, so what do you do? Or what's your, and you would hear writer, police officer, that everyone was so certain and they had this like little box that they fit in perfectly. So I spent a lot of my teenage years and early 20s trying to figure out what that was, office manager, yoga teacher. I've had all the jobs under the sun. And so now that I'm very passionate about not doing what I don't want to do anymore, working for other people and, just in life in general, I find great freedom, but there's also that question, when you hear the phrase, find your true self, it's if there is a true self. If, like you said, we're always kind of figuring it out moment to moment, is there this, like undeniable, like truth underneath us?
I would say yes. And it's tricky because, and we talk about this frequently, our experience of reality is perception. That is how we experience ourselves and the universe, is through perception. And your perception of the universe and yourself can change in infinite ways. So that being said, that means that no perception is in itself truth. They're all valid from the perspective of the perceiver, but they're not reality in itself. It's like a diamond with infinite facets. You're always just looking at one, right? And you're missing the forest for the trees, as it were, right? So if they're all valid, but none of them are truth, then reality itself is all of them and neither. So the only thing that we are left with is what remains. This is why I always say that perception is never truth, though truth includes perception. Truth is what remains, regardless of perception, which is why we always come back to the basic fact that you are here now. Now, you, here, and now are all questionable concepts, but that is the best that we can do in terms of describing the reality of your experience.
Yeah, and that statement, "you are here now," it's funny because we were having a conversation on our Patreon the other day about how, because a lot of people, when they're starting to question things, they're not, I don't know, there's sort of a conviction that comes with recognizing that I am here now is the only thing I really know. So before that conviction comes, there's kind of this agnostic approach to, all beliefs. I'm everything. I'm a Christian. I'm a Muslim. I'm a Buddhist. I'm all these things. Any belief is valid. I don't know. I don't know anything. And it's kind of like a passing of the buck. It's a foisting of responsibility. It's a settling upon some semblance of comfort in that you don't have to dive deeper into it, because through recognizing that I'm here now is all that you know, there's a depth to that you miss if you don't recognize that that's the extent of what you know. Like that shit goes deep, because as Ray said, like I, here, now, those are all things that you can spend an eternity discussing what those actually even mean, right? So in thinking, even and especially, on the side of clinging very tightly to beliefs, it's like I had this image I drew. It's probably in my notebook somewhere. I'm not gonna sort through to try and find it, but it's basically like we kind of sit on this plane, and it's almost like a cross in a way, and we're here now, and then we have all these ideas of like, oh, maybe this is the truth, maybe this is the truth. Oh, I think I should be here. I wish I was here in my life. And it's all of these ideas, these conceptual ideas that take us from the reality of just being here now, and that being the extent of our reality. So as we start to come closer to that recognition, there's a depth that we drop into that allows us to further question that, and kind of there's like a whole nother side to reality that we miss until we recognize the depth that comes through that. So as we settle upon beliefs, or oh, everyone's belief is reasonable, and you have all these ideas of yourself and all of these things that kind of take you from that reality of being here now, you avoid that depth. And once you do settle upon it, there's a depth there. And then underneath that sort of surface, in the image I drew, was like the recognition that you're everything through that, because there's no one else outside of that experience of being here now. It's like everyone is in that experience. That's the reality of it. And then the conceptual takes us from that recognition. And so I think if Dualistic Unity has been anything, it's a deepening into the exploration of what being here now really, really means, and how much can we unravel through recognizing that, and not getting so caught up in the ideas of the shoulds and the potential beliefs and all of these ideas of, oh, well, maybe it's maybe afterlife this, afterlife that. It's like, you're here now. Let's stay here, and let's dig into that.
Yeah, it makes sense. There was something about what you said that just triggered a dream. I just remembered a dream that I had earlier this week. And it was crazy because after the dream, I was like, I don't know if many people are going to understand this, as it is with dreams. So basically, long story short, I had a dream where I saw like the sky, like I was looking out in front of me, and there was trees and buildings and people and all that. And I saw the sky slide down over the trees and the people. And it's like the fabric of reality was pulled, and everything became essentially the sky. Like everything was absorbed by it. It felt staticky. It's the best way to describe it. And I remember being in the experience and judging it and saying, oh, this kind of hurts. It kind of feels uncomfortable. And then I said, wait a minute. I don't have to, in the dream, I'm like, I don't have to judge this. Maybe this is what being one with the universe is like. And then all of a sudden, sky goes back. Everything, reality goes back to normal. And I'm looking around at people and I'm like, did everyone just see what happened? And it's kind of like, in the Matrix, when people fight and then afterwards they just go about their daily business. Like if nothing ever happened, that's kind of what it was like in the dream. So yeah, I woke up from that and I was just like, what if, it sounds woo woo when people say we're all one, or we're, all the universe experiencing itself through different points of reality. But I started thinking, if you're everything and you're experiencing everything, then how could anything be bad? And that's kind of, I guess, like the thought, or the train that I've been on this last week.
That's fantastic. And I just want to say kudos, because if you're having that dream and you're able to have that insight in the middle of a dream, that's indicative of how much work you've been doing on the other side in this dream, because nothing's really changed between one environment and another except the level of detail in regards to the dream. But the insight that you're communicating is the other side of the spectrum to what Andrew and I always kind of laugh about in terms of being like the computer network mentality of unity. Because we always have this mentality of unity, like we're all connected to one another, like we're networked computers, but that's only one side. As much as that's true, there's no difference in energy. Everything's connected regardless of the different forms it takes, so on and so forth. The other side of the perspective is the pure subjective awareness of being reality. that everything actually does stem from you. Like you are the core of the dream. You're the dreamer itself and all of the characters within it. And once you start exploring that end, that's when you start recognizing what we mean by you are God. It changes the entire perspective. It's not about a belief anymore. Now it's about that uncomfortable truth that you are all you've ever known, all you'll ever know, and that as far as you know, existence starts and ends with you, regardless of hearsay evidence of everybody else going, no, no, everything was here before you. Absolutely it was. Believe me, we're all characters in a dream.
Yeah, I mean it certainly makes you wonder, and so many people will, because of the discomfort that comes with it, everything outside of your experience is hearsay. Like there is not actually a way to confirm it. You can get great evidence, look at things, explain history. Oh, look at all these books that talk about all this stuff, the fossils, all of it. Like, we're not saying that that's not like that isn't not likely, but it's still, you have to recognize it's still hearsay. It's still not 100% confirmable ever. And so going back to your dream, it's funny because I see that as very symbolic of, you see this guy kind of get pulled in, you recognize, oh, this is all me. Like, if I'm everything, then it's all me. And then it kind of just like goes back to normal very, very quickly, because it's like, as much as the recognition changes everything, it doesn't change anything. Like, you're still here now, and it's that perspective that shifts. And so, as you said, it allowed you to recognize that, oh, there is no bad. It's like very much the case. There is no objective bad. It comes down to your perspective, and everyone's perspective, as Ray was saying before, makes up the truth. But people get caught up in thinking like, my perspective is my truth. And it's like, okay, but let's recognize here that your perspective isn't the truth. And there's a very important distinction between that, because there is no objective opinion of a certain situation. It is all subjective based on your experience. And the more you recognize that, the more clearly you recognize that, your opinion isn't objective truth, the more willing you are to remain open to possibilities, the more willing you are to remain uncertain, the more willing you are to explore your potential at the end of the day. Because as we settle upon our opinions, one of the main ones we settle upon is our opinion of ourselves. So as that begins to drop, that potential, as the opinion of ourself drops, our potential goes up, because all of a sudden we're opened up to so much more that we were purposefully limiting ourselves to, because we were so afraid of not knowing ourselves, because we were so afraid of that uncertainty that comes with actually not being able to settle upon an opinion and recognize that our opinion is never, ever the truth. And so I think that dream's fucking awesome. That's really cool. And I see a lot of symbolism in it, for sure. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Thanks. You were speaking about limits now, and I think maybe it was a conversation you had with Paige, talking about the fact that we are so limitless that we could actually create limitations. And I heard conceptually, I'm like, that sounds familiar. Like, it's a truth I know somewhere deep inside, but it hasn't been communicated in that way before. So hearing it phrased like that, I was like, shoot, that's fucking right. I was like, how many times do we, put ourselves in these like boxes, and we move throughout the world, and we expect everyone else to kind of be in the same box that we're in, for lack of a better definition, I think that a lot of it, at least for myself, has come to do, or I should say a lot of it lately has been the realization, or trying to get comfortable with the recognition that there's nothing wrong with me. And I know that being on your Discord, a lot of people are kind of going through the same thing. It's kind of like this awareness that you are perfect. You've always been perfect. You'll always be perfect. There's nothing to strive for, nothing to prove. I mean, this is a really foreign concept to people who don't, who haven't heard it before. They're like, what are you talking about? Everything's about progressing to the next level and really defining yourself and being separate from everything and everyone, and making your mark on the world in this, separate sort of way. So it's been interesting, especially having a conversation with your community, to see that there are a lot of people that are struggling with the idea and trying to embrace it and are really working through it like on a day to day. It's like a moment to moment thing. This concept of there's actually nothing wrong with me that I have to fix. I'm not broken in any way.
It's interesting because the flip side to that is, as much as we're trying to accept there's nothing wrong with us, we're also dealing with the fear of letting go of the idea that there's something wrong with us. Because there is the question of, who would I be if nothing was wrong with me? Who would I be if I didn't have all this stuff to think about? Who would I be without all of these fears? And there is a fear there because we don't know. We don't know who we would be if we were free. And so there's all of this uncertainty that goes with that. So we actually cling to a lot of our issues. We cling to the journey to self-awareness in order to avoid it. To some degree, it actually does come to that point where eventually you start to recognize, like, I just don't want to let me go. I'd almost prefer to suffer and think I know what's happening than to let it go and see what's next. And so I find that to be such a huge part of it. It's not just about working your way to it. It's about understanding that to some degree, you've been running from it.
That's funny because I'll make a lot of videos talking about this. There's nothing wrong with you, and it's not so much about figuring out, adding to the idea of yourself. It's just about letting go, questioning all the things you believe to be true about you. And it always fascinates me how much pushback I get, because it's not even like I'm saying there's nothing wrong with me or anything, like I'm perfect and talking about myself. It's like I'm saying you're perfect. I'm saying there's nothing wrong with you. And people are still like, no, 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 no. I got all this. And just as Ray was saying, like they cling to the certainty. People would rather have a certain negative idea of themselves than not know. They would actually rather be sure that they're an awful person, that there's so many things wrong with them, than not be able to say what they are, not be able to say what they point to. And you were talking about, striving, making progress. It's just it's kind of the process that our ego is always in. It's always striving to be something. It always wants to be more. And so more doesn't necessarily have a side. And so people will strive to be more, build a positive idea of themselves. But, you see very often, especially recently, people getting very caught up in the victim mentality. And they would, because the ego doesn't see more as just being more good, it could be more, more positive idea of yourself. It's also more negative idea of yourself. And so people actually think that their value can be derived from suffering more than other people. And so they'll argue with people about who suffers more. And when someone comes around, it's like, oh, there's nothing wrong with you. Like that's pulling all of their value out from them. Like that's how they perceive it, that their value is derived from having something wrong with them and having more wrong with them than other people have wrong with them. Because another thing ego does is constantly compare. So as long as you have more of something than someone else, you have value, which is crazy when you logically like lay it out like that, but that's how it works. And that's why people defend it so much. And that's why people don't want to let go of that. And it gives them some sense of direction. Like they do this because they should. At least, if there's these things wrong with me, I go to this therapist. And not to say that everyone who goes to therapy is clinging to this super tightly. Like people can derive some benefit. And I won't get into that whole conversation because there's a lot there as well. But, in letting go of the idea that there's anything wrong with you, like people feel like they don't have anything to do anymore. Like there's no purpose to doing things. And it's there's this kind of stark mentality shift that you start to experience when you recognize that there's nothing wrong with you. So if there's nothing wrong with you, that means there's nothing you should do. There are no shoulds anymore. And that is where freedom lies, in letting go of the idea that there's anything that you should do or you need to do or you have to do. So it shifts from the shoulds, the have tos, the needs tos, to doing it because you can, doing it because you're able, doing it because you're already in that state of wholeness. There's no more wholeness to become. There's no way to become less whole than you are. So you do it because you can. And that's very uncomfortable for people at first too, because it's not something that many people are experiencing. There's no blueprint for freedom in our society, because almost no one is free, because everyone's clinging to the narrative, to the idea of themselves, to that false certainty that has become very much a prison. And so this is another thing we talk about a lot, is how to live once you let go of the shoulds, because it is uncomfortable at first. It very much can be, because people aren't used to it. There's nothing to point to, like I can follow this path or do this. It's like, no, you're free. There's no more map. There's no more blueprint anymore. So everything is doing things for the sake of doing them. And without that reason, though, people get very uncomfortable, and oftentimes they run back to that false sense of certainty because they don't like the discomfort that comes with being free.
It's the devil we know. I mean, that's really it. And I just want to say to your listeners that all of this sounds great. I understand, but you're listening to this and you're listening to us, and it may come across as theory. This is stuff that we wrote, or that we read, or something along those lines that we got from someone else. And this is the Theory Studio, so that makes sense. But I need you to know that I went through a decade of self-loathing. I went through a long, long time of being lost in this mentality of settling for false certainty, despite the fact that it was literally my living hell from day in and day out for years and years and years. And it's so interesting, Andrew, because you're saying something that I find it so funny looking back. The simple expression that there was nothing wrong with me was both the thing I wanted to hear the most and the least. I find that to be just tragic and kind of funny in hindsight, because it was the thing I wanted to know about myself, that I had value. And yet it undermined everything I was invested in as a source of my value at the time. And so I couldn't hear it. I didn't want to hear it, because it undercut all of the tragedy that I thought made me what I was. And yet it was the thing that I wanted the most, despite all that tragedy. And I just couldn't accept it. And how many people are stuck in that? How many people want to hear there's nothing wrong with you, and immediately their brain's like, yes, there is, and we've always thought this, and this is certainty. And you're just like, maybe there's not. Maybe there's not. Maybe it's just about how do I adapt to what I'm going through. Maybe it's not about me at all. Maybe I have way more potential than I think I do. But in that is that uncertainty, and you have to be willing to find out. It's like that quote by Buddha, we're forged like steel through fire. It's the point. You got to go through the fire.
Good point. I like that. Maybe some of it has to do with the ability to trust yourself to a degree, that you will be okay, and like this inherent value that everyone seems to not recognize. We're constantly thinking about, do I have to make more money, get the bigger house, have more kids? Like, what status or what is it that I have to outwardly show to people in order for them to put value on me that I really want? Not that it's something I bring or something I have inherently. It's something that other people give me, like this fucking gift, because I've met their expectation. You know what I mean? Now that I think about it, it's like, why do I want you to give me value? That doesn't make any damn sense. When it comes to like redefining yourself, if that's even possible, and trusting yourself, that deep down, I think for a lot of people, and I know for myself, it is that question of value. It is that, how is it that I am just valuable innately on my own? Even though everyone tells you that it's something to strive for, how is it that it's something that we can recognize on a moment to moment basis?
This is a great question. It really does come down to the recognition that the self you're trying to have faith in isn't the self that you are. The self you're trying to have faith in is a concept. It's an idea. It's a chair that you're standing up on, trying to feel taller as a way of feeling confident as you walk forward. But because it's a chair you're standing up on, it's a chair that can get kicked out from underneath you. And so there is no confidence in a self-image. There is no level of strength when it comes to relying on your ego to move forward. And so the self that you have to have faith in is what you are when you're not thinking about yourself. So there is no way outside of putting that self in more and more situations to recognize what that self is capable of. See, that's the thing about the ego, is that we try and boost ourselves up so we'll go into a situation where we perform in one way or another. But we would have performed one way or another regardless of the narrative we told ourselves up until that point, because we were already who we were. There's nothing that you have to try to accomplish. What you need to start doing is putting yourself in situations where you recognize, and you can put yourself in situations where what you're capable of unfolds. So that way you don't have to tell yourself a thing. Just watch. Just watch. And the less you try and tell yourself any story whatsoever, the better you're going to get at everything. At everything, because you're actually involved with it. It's like the Tao Te Ching. There's a chapter in the Tao Te Ching about the archer. And the point is very simple, that an archer who is both focused at the target and focused on the prize that he'll win for hitting the target is not focused on the target. Their attention is divided in two. And so their efficiency has been cut in half. And this is something we do all the time. We do it all the time, trying to strive for the future or strive for some idea of ourselves, and we remove ourselves from what we're doing. How many times have you dropped something, hurt yourself, bumped into someone, made some mistake that you wouldn't have otherwise, and it was only because you were worried about how people might perceive the job that you were doing? So in your worry about doing a good job, you did a worse job. Whereas if you were focused on what you were doing, it would have went better because it was about you. It was about the job you were doing. And because when we're involved with what we're doing, it becomes its own reward, the job becomes better. You ever notice that? Whenever you get into what you're doing without your preferences or your opinion of it, all of a sudden it's like it just goes by smoothly. You enter like the zone, whether it's a challenge or not. The challenge is something that you're involved with rather than complaining about, rather than worrying about, rather than, oh God, if I don't do this, it's going to be the end of the world. All that stuff. It just goes out the window. And so you find yourself more patient, more attentive, more intelligent, more sensitive. It changes everything. Right? So that self is not a self that you can have faith in the religious sense. It's like trying to have faith in God. It doesn't work, right? You actually just have to keep jumping in. You actually just have to allow yourself to keep seeing how wrong your limited idea of yourself is. And eventually you'll stop forming one.
Yeah, letting go of the concern for the outcome is one of the most freeing things you can ever do. But when you're attached to the idea of yourself and everything means something about you, it's very difficult to let go of that attachment to the outcome because the outcome means something about you. But as that idea of yourself drops, the outcome becomes significantly less relevant. And that's a big part of the shift. And so then it's just the thing for the thing. And when you recognize this is all just what it comes down to is just having experience, and you don't actually know, again, going back to uncertainty, you don't actually know what outcome is going to be the best for your life. But our brain, again, tries to settle upon this thing like, okay, if this goes this way, then that's a good thing. If this goes this way, then it's a bad thing. But there's an infinite number of situations that are going to follow said event that you're concerned about or whatever it may be. And so there's no possible way to know which outcome is better for that. So the outcome has always been irrelevant. And then you can actually come back to where you're at and doing it for the sake of doing it for its own reward. But it is, again, as much as we talk about this, it is definitely a practice too. It's something you can get better at. Having faith in yourself is not just this shift. You read a book or you meditate for 10 minutes. And it's like, all right, now I got faith in myself. Like, no, you got to get into it, dig in, and it's not going to be comfortable at first. If you've been relying on all these external validations and factors in your life, like you're probably not going to have a whole lot of faith in yourself right away. But as it unfolds, as you become more comfortable with the discomfort, as you start to see situations unravel, and you thought it going one way was going to be best and it wasn't, you thought going one way was going to be worse than it wasn't, you're kind of reinforcing to that brain of yours that's trying to settle upon the certainty that you don't know. But it's not something that you can sit there and try and focus on and learn. It's something you have to experience. It's something you have to go into. And so you have to be willing to take that first step, not really knowing where your foot's going to land, but knowing that it's going to land. And as you keep taking those steps, it becomes a lot easier. And the expertise comes not in knowing where you're going to step, but just in knowing that you're going to land somewhere. And once you do land, you're going to be able to figure it out. And that's having faith in yourself. It's not a belief. It's not something you have to, study. It's something you got to do. Faith in yourself is an ongoing practice, and it builds and it's cumulative, and it gets easier the more you do it.
Yeah, I find that to some degree, uncertainty brings freedom. I know you mentioned that earlier. After you get past, the anxiety and you finally reach a point where you're like, all right, and you come to the realization everything is actually uncertain anyway. So I might as well just embrace it and, go with the flow. I find that there's a possibility, or like there's like a door of possibilities that comes with uncertainties that not everyone is aware of, and it's something that we don't really take into account because, like you said, we cling so closely to the idea of whatever it is that we want to happen. I know that for myself, at least through religion, you're really taught not to trust yourself. You're, the worst
sinner.
Yeah, you're not only are you a sinner and you've done all these horrible things from like the moment of birth, but you're not supposed to follow your heart, and you're not, your heart is what is it that they say in the Bible? Foolish, and like, you're just not supposed to do what you want to do, pretty much. So I know that to a degree that's conditioned me and many others into not tapping into that like inner knowing that we know is there, and we know would give us a lot more freedom and a lot more acceptance of uncertainty and just like being our true selves. I think it's just interesting to kind of like peel back the layer of the need to look outward for answers all the time. Constantly looking at others like, do you know what you're doing? I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. Do you? Only to then realize as I've become an adult that no one knows what the hell they're doing. Even the people twice my age are still trying to figure it out.
Absolutely. And it is kind of a shame, like in the Bible, in the New Testament especially, we'll just talk about Jesus. He talks about the narrow path traveled by few and the wide path traveled by many. Nobody seems to clue in that the narrow path is not religion at all. It's like, look at all these people on that path. That must be the narrow path he's talking about. And it's not in any way, shape, or form. And then you look, I think it's in the book of Matthew, where Jesus is talking to a bunch of priests, and he's like, you go out of your way to travel around converting people, and you make them twice as damned as you are. And yet here we are in religion being twice as damned by listening to these people teach us religion, and they don't even see it, which is the funniest part. But it was always about this. Like, it's always right in front of us, but it requires us to walk away from religion, which I think is kind of funny and comedic and tragic at the same time. Like when I'm talking to anybody who believes in God or Allah or whatever they want to call it, I always hear that ounce of truth, and I always see it lost on the idea of themselves. There's always this fearful clinging to, no, I believe in this, therefore I'm safe and I'm saved and all of this stuff. And you're like, well, hold on, maybe you're misinterpreting that. You ever think maybe it's this and this? No. And they just shut you down. And so that's where you recognize, like, right, this isn't about God. This was never about God. This was just not having to think for yourself. Basically, we've created a crutch. Everybody's afraid of letting it go because they don't want to believe that they can walk on their own. And that's really all it is. That's all religion comes down to. But going through it, and again, the clutches that it's had on our history doesn't help, right? But it's just like any addict. It takes time to kick it. And collectively, we've been addicted to false certainty for a very long time. Religion is starting to fade away, but we have lots of other forms of false certainty in terms of government and the economy and all that other fun stuff. Don't worry, the UN's going to solve all that climate stuff by 2050. What? It sounds like Jesus is coming a second time. Like it's the same promise of false certainty. And it's just because we're addicted to it. Whereas if we stopped that, we would end up back here in the present. And that's the narrow path. That's what everybody tries to describe, and it gets turned into a religion. I always find it funny that religion is what happens when you lack faith.
It's funny because as much as, religion is a form of something that reinforces identity, as Ray was saying, there's tons of things. We're letting go of religion, sure, but we are far, far, far from letting go of identity. And I see religion as just one of the branches of something that can reinforce your identity. But there's tons of things that reinforce the idea of yourself. And so it's funny because, we'll pick on all identity, from religion to nationalism to gender identity to anything that reinforces the idea of yourself. And we'll post back-to-back videos talking about one and then about another, and we'll have everyone mad at us. Everyone will be like, oh, that's and say reasons why it's wrong. And it's pointing at this. It's the same message, just with a different filter placed on it, a different filter of identity, a different thing that reinforces the idea of you. And that's what we're addicted to. We're addicted to knowing ourselves, having an idea of ourselves. We're addicted to something that's impossible. And that's reinforcing the illusion that we're experiencing, reinforcing the illusion that we're divided. So all of these beliefs are reinforcing that illusion. And there's so many things that goes by way of it, because we think that's where our value is derived from. We think being this means that, we have value. Knowing yourself means you have value, whether it's, as I was saying before, whether it's a positive idea of yourself or a negative idea of yourself, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And there's so many things. As much as we'll focus on religion in certain ways, it's just one of the ways that identity is reinforced and expressed. But there's tons of things. And so there's lots of stuff that we touch on specifically, and it's all pointing to the same thing. It's not that religion is the issue, it's that identity is the issue, and religion is just a way to express that.
I remember when I first reached out to you guys about being on the podcast, in my message I said I wanted to talk about how to embrace the journey of becoming who it is that you want to be, because we all have this idea, at least most people, right? There's some of us that definitely want to leave an impact and have this, maybe not pressure, maybe for some it's pressure, but others it's not, but this idea that we have to leave a mark on the world. I see you smiling, Andrew. So what are your thoughts on, I guess, the importance of that, or the identity behind that? Is that just people trying to seek value? Is that just another way in which we're trying to feel important by leaving stuff and making stuff for other people?
I do think so. I think so. It's funny because this is something we've been going back and forth. This is an insight that's been hitting me really hard this week. It's interesting because as much as we talk so much, live streaming episodes, all that stuff, that there's always, I don't know, there tends to be sort of themes for things, and for everyone going through stuff and whatnot. But for me, it tends to just kind of, I don't know, deepen and shift and whatever. So this week, that is what's been hitting me. So it kind of occurred to me that as much as there is the recognition of unity on how we perceive the external, there's also unity on the internal. So it's not that because there is no division in reality, there's not a bunch of different minds wandering around. It's one mind that we're all sort of tapping into, that we all are. Like, it's all my mind as your mind. It's all your mind as my mind, because there is no division between us either. Like, we are one, and therefore there is no we. And so as we try and change the world on the external, a lot of that does, as you were pointing to, reinforce the idea of ourself. We want to feel valuable and be able to point and be like, I changed the world. I did that. And that makes me better. And it's the whole narrative and perception of division and reinforcing of identity. And what kind of hit me pretty hard was that as much as we perceive that external change, there are internal changes happening always. There is a mentality shifting. As my mind changes, my mind changes. And so as I perceive division in the world, try and change the world outside of myself, it hinders my ability to change that internal world. And again, I say internal and external, but there's no division between those either. It's only the perception of the division between the internal and the external. So I've been realizing that as much as I can get caught up in trying to change other people, other people in quotes, that's hindering my ability to allow that process of my mind changing to continue on. And so as you let go of the need to change the world because it makes you more valuable, it means something about you, that process of changing the internal world actually ramps up. Actually, it accelerates, because you've dropped the idea that there is anything to change that isn't you. It's all you. So what are you really changing? Whose mind are you changing? if not your own. And if you're caught up in changing other people's mind, are you really recognizing that lack of division very clearly, or is it actually getting in the way of your recognition? And so I think as we let go of the need to change that external world, the internal mentality is shifting even more quickly. And that's really all you ever have to do, because as much as we think that we have a bunch of different minds, as my mind gets clearer with this recognition, everyone else's mind is getting more clear. It's just that we don't, because it's not a visual impact, we don't recognize it, but it's still happening because there is no division between minds. It's all the same mind. And so I think in order to allow that mentality shift to continue, we have to let go of the need to try and change this perceived external world. And as we try to, it hinders our ability to actually make change through that mentality shift on the internal.
That's interesting. I was just thinking that we look at it in terms of it being a hindrance on our ability to change everything because we perceive division. But the perception of division is not the reality of division. The fact is, we're always connected. And so the only thing that ever changes is how we are affecting the rest of us. And so when you look at the mentality of ego or the mentality of a legacy, and I'll reference the poem Ozymandias. If anybody wants to check out an awesome poem about how pointless a legacy is, check out Ozymandias. Fantastic. Tremble ye mighty at my works, and there's nothing. It's just dust. But that mentality will push you. It's the basis of the motivation industry, very much. And I know I used to be a part of the motivation industry. I was out there like pushing executives to be all they could be and all of that. And it was all very much based on this carrot and stick mentality. And those people will put in the energy. They will work hard, some of them, and they will excel in whatever it is they're doing. Like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, these people, regardless of their divisive mentality, have pushed and pushed and pushed as far as that path will go. And look at where they are. Now, are they doing anything good with that? No. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of it's distorted by the divisive mentality that they've been invested in. But what I'm saying is, regardless of their perception of division, they changed the entire world through just investing in a mentality for long enough and putting enough energy into it. But that's every mentality. It's just that we're all walking in the same direction of ego. We're all putting into the same mentality. And so that's all we're seeing in the world is more and more division. But if we turned around in ourselves, same thing, it's the same rules. It just manifests differently. The more you put in, the more you affect everything. And on that side of the fence, the more you put in means recognizing it's all you. So it's a totally different mentality. The one side is recognizing it's divided. So you push more. So you take advantage of more people. You need more. You got to accumulate more. All of the carrot and stick mentality is really based on division. But the other mentality is based on being whole and complete in yourself. Here and now, just letting yourself see what that means rather than telling yourself what you think it means. Totally different. And that's how things unfold. So I find it very interesting that regardless of the mentality you choose, you are always affecting the whole. You may not see it. That doesn't mean it's not happening.
I think last night on, I think it was the Patreon call, you were talking, Ray, about the 100th monkey, if I'm not mistaken, right? If you can get a little bit into that, because I know it's that one area, I think it's like monkeys on one island basically had some sort of like effect mysteriously on another group of monkeys.
Absolutely. This is a great one. You can actually look this up online. It's the 100th monkey phenomenon. It happened specifically on a group of islands off the coast of Japan with macaque monkeys. And basically, one group of monkeys on a specific island would eat fruit that fell from the tree into the sand. And as they were eating that fruit, it would get in their teeth. And anybody who's had sand in their mouth knows that sucks. That's not a lot of fun. But they're monkeys, so they're not exactly thinking about these things. They're just trying to eat. Well, one female monkey at one point figures out that she can actually just go take the fruit over to the water, wash it off, and no more sand in her mouth. Ta-da! So she had an insight. And she taught that to her child. So her child didn't have to eat sand either. Well, other monkeys eventually, over weeks and months, started picking up on this little insight, like, aha, look at that. We don't have to dine on sand. This is great. And so they started picking it up one by one. And after a certain point, around the point where about half the monkeys had started learning this, all of a sudden it was an exponential jump. to the point where almost 90 to 95% of the monkeys picked it up immediately. And it was because there was this tipping point within their culture on that island. And so we're always affecting one another, and we can see that in this very small example on the island. But the cool part about this is that they were not the only monkeys around. There were other islands with other macaque monkeys. But they don't swim, they don't have boats, they don't communicate, they don't have cell phones. And so there was no way for one group of monkeys to communicate with another group of monkeys. Well, right around the time where that tipping point happened, all of a sudden the other groups of monkeys on the other island started developing the same strategy for washing off their fruit. So there was a tipping point in the collective mentality that caused a ripple within monkeys that were not even in physical contact with the original group. We are not as divided as we think. And this has been proven even in quantum entanglement. The Nobel Prize for last year in physics was very much on the non-local universe. The fact that two particles can be in completely opposite directions, completely opposite ends of the universe, and interacting with one will make the other one react simultaneously, regardless of distance. So what that means is that there is no distance. There is just the perception of distance. Everything is actually in the same lack of place and lack of time. This is why they said it is the non-local universe, and it is changing the doors on everything we think about in terms of quantum physics and science. The universe doesn't exist anywhere except to you.
Very cool. I love that. I remember being on the call last night and hearing you explain that phenomenon, and I was like, oh my God, I've heard similar stories in the past, but never put quite that way. It's interesting to think, I guess, kind of like going back to my dream, that affecting one thing or that things basically aren't what they seem to be, it reminds me. So I had another, I don't know why I'm talking about dreams so much. I had another dream a few years ago regarding my dad. Now, my dad's no longer with us, but in the dream, I was like sitting next to him on the couch, and kind of like in a video game, like Mortal Kombat or something like that, it shows you like stats of a character. All of a sudden, like his stats came up, and it was like father, human, son, brother, police officer, right? And I remember thinking in that dream, like, holy shit, like he wore a lot of hats. You know what I mean? Like he was so many different things. And so that's a dream I think of, pretty often, as you can tell, because I still remember it very clearly. And it makes me think of like, all the labels and the possibilities, I guess, I think sometimes all the possibilities are paralyzing, and knowing that you do have an effect on the collective and the collective has an effect on you, and the joy, but also scariness in that to some degree, because it means that you really don't have control in anything, I guess, which is, I guess, what we're all trying to work through.
And you never have. That's the thing that helps. It really does. All of a sudden, when it dawns on you that regardless of how much you've been grasping with the idea that you can be in control, you never have been. All you've ever had is influence. This is something my Sifu told me when I was learning Kung Fu, was that we never have control in a fight, but we do have influence. And that's very true over life as a whole. You never have control. Anything could happen, but based on whether or not you're paying attention, whether or not you are assuming something's going to happen or projecting something that you need to happen or anything like that, you have more or less influence from moment to moment to moment. And that is the best that you can hope for. It's what you've had this entire time. And since you're still here, you're doing quite well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people will get caught up in the idea of control and desiring control and wanting control. And when you see the two of them, influence and control, if you're so focused on control, it's like you have influence here now in this moment. You think control is out there in the future, and so you're literally overlooking the influence that you do have, thinking that control is a possibility. It's just an illusion. It's just a mirage. And so as you let go of that need for control, of that idea that control even exists, come back and you start looking around where you're at, and you're like, oh shit, there's influence right here. Oh wow, I've had influence the entire time. I can actually do things from this point. I don't have control necessarily, because control is based on the outcome of a situation. Like you can do your best for something and you have no idea how it's going to actually turn out because you don't have control of it, but you do have influence over it. And we discount, we overlook, we don't realize the influence that we do have. And so when people think that there's control, they recognize that it's an illusion. They're like, oh my gosh, so someone can just, what if someone starts moving my hand and I lose control of it? And it's like, that's discounting the influence that you have because we're so caught in the narrative of control, thinking that it's either control or no control. It's like there's another thing. It's kind of like the discussion of God. It's like, oh, there's either God or there isn't a God. And it's like, or maybe you're it. Like you either have control or you don't have control, or maybe you have influence. And as God, you have influence here now. And so as you let go of that desire for that control, the influence that you do have becomes a lot more available, noticeable, and you can actually start to do things with it. And you start doing things for the sake of doing them. And that influence that you recognize that you've always had becomes its own reward. It's like, what do you mean you're not doing anything? You're doing everything right now. You're impacting all of reality for all of eternity in each and everything that you do. Like, that's cooler than anything that I ever believed that I could do in my life before when I didn't recognize that I had influence and I was so caught up in the idea of control. You've had influence the whole time. You've been influencing everything the whole time. It's just your idea that you weren't because you have this limited idea of yourself that can only do certain things because of your beliefs about it.
And I think it really talks about like how much power we have in each and every moment. Like it's a tough realization to realize that I've been choosing to be this version of Brandy for like this amount of time, And so what that means, what that looks like, how other people interpret you, you know what I mean? Their expectations of you, all of that gets placed on us by society, really. I think that it's very easy to forget that freedom that you talk about is really like a moment to moment decision, and it's something that you really have to strive towards. Because especially when it comes to control and wanting control, people find safety in that, which is why they seek it so much. Because obviously, if I can control what's going to happen in the very next moment, I know that I'll at least be safe. Forgetting that they've been safe their whole life up until this point. There's nothing that's happened to you that you haven't, gone through and been okay on the other side of. So this fear of I won't be okay in the future is I don't know. I guess it's just really interesting, like why we have this like low hum, like I said, of anxiety or low hum of like disbelief in ourselves.
It's interesting. I made a video back in 2018-ish. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Discover Transcendence. It's like 48 minutes long. But in that, I talk about Jane Lovinger, who was a developmental psychologist in the 50s. And she was talking about the stages of ego development. And as a parent, I can vouch for these stages of ego development. They're pretty good. Go and check them out by any means. But as we come into the world, we really do go through these stages because we come into the world with no concept of anything. Not even any concepts. We don't have any language, any ideas, anything. We're just very much that raw awareness, but with a great many limitations, right? Because we're babies. We can't do anything for ourselves. And so the idea of division is something that we actually have to learn. This is why we have object permanence as one of our first lessons. It's because when people leave the room, we assume they stopped existing because to us, we're all that exists. The idea that there's more to us that we can't even see doesn't dawn on us at all. And so we start to learn division. And in that division, we learn that there's a me versus everything else. So on goes the journey now into forming the idea of me. Who am I? Who is everybody else? How do I sit amongst all of this? And it gives us a point of reference. And so we go through these stages of developing this idea of ourselves as a means of understanding our environment. But we go through it in very simplistic ways. This is why children, it's all about, give me everything I need. I'm afraid, I'm hungry, focus on me, focus on me. And then they start to get a little bit more ability. They start to get a little bit older, start to be able to do a little bit more for themselves. And then there's a little bit of independence. Now I want to be a bit more myself, but who am I? Who do I hang out with? Who validates me? And there's this idea of myself. So you start hanging out with groups that are close to you, groups that resonate with you. But as you get older, you're supposed to eventually come to the point where you recognize your idea of yourself. While it helps, is also hindering your ability to interact with groups that you don't identify with, that don't look at things the same way that you do. And so we're supposed to grow up past that stage. That's only stage 3, by the way, of 10 stages of ego development. And as a culture, we don't get past stage 3 or 4, which is very much that need for a social norm, very much that need to abide by a rigid structure so we can compare ourselves and our value to everybody else who doesn't abide by it. That's all part of our developmental process. But we're supposed to get past that by around the age of 20 to 25. We're supposed to enter like stage 5 and 6, which Lovinger called the ideal mentality for adult society. And yet almost none of us get there because our society runs on stage 3 and 4. Our economy runs on that feeling of lack, on that feeling of I need to be more. Everything pounds this into our heads. So on the one hand, it's part of it is purely biological. It's part of our development as a species. It's part of our development in terms of our brain and our amygdala and everything about our physiology, as well as your idea of yourself. But the society around you is stuck in high school. And so everybody, once you start to climb out of that mentality, it's very much like a crab bucket. One crab tries to crawl out, the other crab's trying to get out, drag him back in. It's exactly what's happening. We're trying to crawl our way out of that mentality, and everybody's like, what do you mean you're not trying to be like this? What do you mean you're not trying to? And it's just this whole mentality of judgment. And you're like, Jesus, am I not doing the right thing? Like, why is everybody coming down on me like this? It's because you're invalidating their fucking game. That's all it is. You're just invalidating everything they're invested in for a source of value. My daughter is going through this right now. She's 15, as I mentioned. So a lot of her friends are teenagers, and they are all trying to self-validate. And so they're all judging all the time. And she's trying to have a normal, rational conversation, as she does with me and some of the people who have come to our retreat, adults who aren't just trying to self-satisfy. And she's like, why is it so easy to talk to these people and not my friends? It's like, because your friends aren't actually talking to you. They're talking to themselves. They're just using you as a prop. There's a very different mentality. And if you're going to come out of it, then you have to let go of your friends. You have to let go of the need to be liked. You have to let go of the idea that people validating you is the same as you having more value. It's not the case. It's not the case. And as long as you need people to validate you so you feel like you have value, you will settle for shittier and shittier and shittier people over and over and over again. In order to change your life, you have to be your life. You have to be the end all and be all of your life. It has to be about you. And what's funny is in that mentality, when you've stopped worrying about whether people respect you, people will respect you for that. When you stop worrying about whether people like you or whether you're interesting to other people and you actually become interested in things yourself, people will find you interesting. It's so half-assed backwards all the time. It's like, I want to be this. Do it for you. Do it for you. People will notice if they can, but not everybody can, because some people are just too involved in the idea of themselves to ever appreciate what it is you are. That has nothing to do with you.
Yeah, and I think when you're first sort of waking up to all these realities, it helps a lot to recognize that. It helps to recognize the stages of ego development. It helps to recognize, our societal stage, basically, because everything makes more sense when you understand that. Because a lot of times when people first, wake up, understand they're not the idea of themselves, that they don't have to, cling to so many false certainties, they start talking about it and they're wondering, as Ray was saying, they're looking around like, why is everyone running away from this conversation? So understanding why they do it, as we've talked about all throughout this episode, basically helps. It helps you to recognize, and even recognizing that there's no one you have to change, understanding that there's no one outside of you that you have to convince or convert or free, because you can't free anyone else. It has to come through them. But through changing yourself, you are changing them, because there is no division between that either. And so I think a lot of people will get frustrated, will get angry, will get sad and depressed even after recognizing this, even after being a little bit freer from the prison they've created, because they're waking up to a really fucked up society, like a society that is still very much caught in all of these things, chasing the carrot, running from the stick, and not really giving a shit who they step on their way to that carrot, as opposed to understanding that they're only stepping on themselves. they're only hurting themselves. They're only harming themselves when they're harming, other people. And so that understanding, I think, helps because a lot of people get caught up in, we saw it after our retreat too. A lot of people went back to their lives and they had been in this place. Like our retreats are, not to toot our own horn too much, but they're fucking magical. Like they're a place that it doesn't exist very often in society. A place where, obviously, everyone's sort of not doing their, besides us, we're, working as we're there. So there's no need to cling to a schedule. Time as much doesn't become so much of a thing. And so they're like, oh my God, you can actually live like this. This is how things could be. And then they go back into reality and they talk about it, tell people about it, and they get visceral reactions because people don't want to hear that. They're defending their prisons that they think is giving them that comfort. But understanding why people do that, where they're coming from, where our society is at, what we can do to actually change it, as opposed to trying to force it to change, because that really only ever does the opposite, as we've seen so many times in people trying to force change, doesn't actually make any change. So you have to relax into just the reality of what you are, understand that it's happening. Progress is being made. It is all cumulative. You don't have to change anyone else because you can't. Because even when you think you are, you're only ever changing yourself. So if you can focus on that and see everything unravel and see the world change as you.
And I think it also has to do with the question of how much struggle are you willing to let go of, you know? Um, I guess we mentioned it earlier when we were talking about how people identify with their crutches and their perceptions of themselves, that even though they can be negative, that it's still something that they cling on to for a sense of meaning and purpose. Um, but I think that in, I guess, like finding your community and in having these conversations with these people, it's been very refreshing to see that even though you sometimes feel alone, that you're not actually alone. Like, I guess kind of collectively we are kind of on the same um, wavelength, because I know, at least for myself, at 7 something in the morning the Discord beep starts going off, and it'll keep going on randomly throughout the day, at least until about 10:30 my time Eastern. And so it's like an all day conversation. So I'm constantly communicating with other individuals or myself, exploring these questions of identity and, basically our place in this whole big crazy mess that is our universe, I guess. So I thank you guys for creating this community, this podcast, all of your work, and the space for people to have great conversation and not be judged. I think that's been huge. So I want to thank you guys for taking the time out of your day to meet with me and for everything that you've created so far. I think it's great.
I just wanted to say thank you for using it and making it valuable, because I mean, at the end of the day, and I know, I spent like half my life trying to have this conversation and finding no one. No one. Like for a long time, it was just me. And I kept thinking, it'd be really nice if there was someone to chat with about all this. And then you keep going regardless. And then you start to recognize, like, oh, geez, I can make that for people. I can actually do
Yeah.
that for people just by offering a space. And it's different when you think, like, I've got to do this, got to change the world, we've got to get out there. There's almost this need that drives people away. There's none of that relaxed attitude. So it's so counterintuitive. But I just want to say that everything that you just said makes me feel great about everything that we've been doing, and I really appreciate all the work that you've done and how it brought you to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Brandy. This has been, my favorite thing to do is have this conversation. So I appreciate you, creating a space for us to do it with you here now. And I'm excited to have more chats and interact with you now that you're on Patreon. You get to talk to us all the time. And I appreciate all of your insights and everything you add to the conversation, because that's what makes this, is everyone's unique experiences as me just adds to the collective experience and our ability to grow and evolve as a society. So thank you.
Thanks, guys. Where can people find you?
So you can find Dualistic Unity on pretty much every podcasting platform, or you can search Dualistic Unity on Google, and we are the first 3 or 4 pages of search results. Dualisticunity.com if you want to register for our weekly free group, which is every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. You can just join us on screen for one of these Zoom calls and see what the community is really all about. If you would like to join us on Patreon, it's patreon.com/dualisticunity, and you can talk to us up to 5 days a week in our group chats there.
Love it. Thank you guys again for having the conversation with me today. And thanks so much for joining us, everyone. I'll see you all next week.